A little girl was cursed with the horrific memory of watching her own mother be hacked by what could only be compared to Friday the 13th, only this was the day of death for more than one. With the images carved into her childhood like a Halloween pumpkin, Deanna Erbert was the only witness to a bloody, gory, horrific crime scene that disembodied Doreen Erbert, her mother, one of her two parents, leaving only a big pool of blood and a mangled corpse scattered throughout their living room. It was not only a Halloween night that brought on the wretched memories which will haunt this family forever, but their own family member, which took away any bit of innocence that this little girl had at the age of 4. She had a front row seat to the gruesome crime scene we're talking about today. Doreen Erbert was born in Santa Rosa, California in 1952 to her two parents, Franklin Gale Hitchens, who was 32, and her mother, Catherine Irene Nocetti, who was 25 years old. And at the time, actually, her dad was a military veteran who was in World War II from 1940 to 1947. Now, as a child, Doreen, who was Doreen Ray Hitchens, actually was known to grow up very loving, peaceful, and happy, as well as very supportive around herself and her family, and this led on as she was growing up. While working in her new life as a physical therapist, Doreen's loving, gentle, and generous personality really began to blossom as she became a young woman and began her early career as a physical therapist. This not only really worked for herself just as being a person, but for her office as well, and the clientele of large numbers that she was attracting into her office. And this was actually good for someone else that would come later into the story, who ended up being a man named William Michael Dennis, also known as Mike, who actually was a sprayer. He worked at the Lockheed store, which was pretty much right next door to where her physical therapy office was. This made it really convenient for the two to get along, to see each other consistently, and they really hit it off. But as for Mike, he pretty much had quite the opposite experience in growing up that Doreen had, as she had this bubbly personality that put her around a lot of people and socializing in general. Mike actually grew up with a hearing impairment and was deaf in one of his ears, so he had to carry around a hearing aid. And in those days, it was quite different from today where you can put it in your ear and forget about it. He actually had to carry around a small box that pretty much tied around his belt loop and connected a wire from there all the way up to his ear, which caused him to be very shy, very awkward, and avoiding pretty much any social interaction. He had trouble getting friends, he had trouble dating, and eventually this caused him to really lack in self-confidence, and he eventually started to carry around a lot of depression. Although this really started to shift for Mike with his self-confidence and his comfortability around himself, because once he had met Doreen, he really started to gain interest in her and sought after her a lot in the day-to-day. The two really began to get to know each other, and he thought that she might even be the one for him. Now, they started to get serious. They started to date for a few months, and even after a few months, they actually decided to get married to each other. They really started to look after each other in this way. And they were pretty well off into their careers at this point, and were wanting to get even more serious to start a family. They were looking after each other, and they wanted to even look after someone else. So they eventually had a baby boy named Paul Dennis, who they were now also looking after. Their baby boy, Paul Dennis, was born April 17th, 1976 in Santa Clara County, and at this point, Doreen had been working as a physical therapist for probably around 4 or 5 years. So at this point, the family of 3 was pretty intimate, pretty off into themselves, and wanting to start a family life. They were more well off. They were going to purchase a home and live together in that way, building their lives together. But they also had their own problems as family. Now, Mike, he was really interested in being a father. He really loved this boy and wanted to be there. But at the same time, he and Doreen were having their own issues as parents, just getting the groove of having a newborn and trying to be there for him. It was really stressing them out and causing a lot of problems as far as anxiety and just managing their careers go. So they actually ended up having a divorce not that long after, in about 1977, and things really began to get rocky for them as a family from there on out. Now, through their legal obligations and financial situation, they ended up staying in Paul's life. But as far as how quick things were going for them, they had just divorced, they started their relationship pretty fast and moved quickly into their marriage, and now they were trying to navigate how they were going to raise their son Paul at this point. And it ended up working in sort of the broken home way of life. This was now going to be their new normal, and while Doreen ended up maintaining full custody of Paul at this time, but as far as Mike would go as the father, he ended up having some responsibilities to take on, and he did it proudly, as far as being able to now see Paul about once a week, every weekend. He would pretty much visit him And this was now their new way of managing things because, well, Paul was only a couple of years old at the time. But some time would go by, and Mike still really wanted to be a dad and a father to Paul, and so he stayed in his life through those weekends, and he was really cherishing his time as being a dad. But what really bothered him at this point was that he wasn't okay with the divorce. He was in love with Doreen, and he really stayed bitter and angry and frustrated about the entire situation of separation, and this really stayed with him. But as far as Doreen goes, and how the two grew up, polar opposite experiences from one another, this pretty much continued, and Doreen still had polar opposite experiences even after the divorce. She began dating. She began really meeting other people and moving on rather quickly once again, and she would even go on to meet a man named Charles Erbert after meeting him through a local carpet store. He was actually the owner of that store, and the two would begin to start to get serious in their own respect. They met only about a year after the entire divorce with Mike happened, and they would go on to hit it off even stronger than she did with Mike. So much stronger, in fact, that only after about a year of dating, they actually had their own baby together, a daughter named Deanna Erbert, around November of 1979. Now, at this point, they were also taking it pretty fast. They had begun raising, well, Paul and Deanna together. Now, this just, I guess, goes to show just how quickly she would move on from Mike, and maybe in being in her 20s, having her career, the stress of her firstborn, she really didn't even pay any attention to just how much the first relationship might have gone. Maybe Mike really didn't mean as much to her as she thought, because now she was really focused on the four of them, now with Charles, having her daughter, and Paul with her. Especially because of how they were moving in their own relationship at this point. Not only had Doreen and Charles had Deanna in that year of 1979, but they had also gotten married, and now she was planning on moving a step even further. She wanted to bring Paul and Deanna along with her to move into Charles' house, the house that he had purchased 8 years earlier. He had already been living there. He had already established his life for almost a decade as being the owner of a carpet store. And, well, the four were now going to live together with him. And now Paul was going to be an older brother. He was about 3 years old at this point, and he was going to understand just that peaceful way of living that Doreen had now once known. This was really all while Mike Dennis still stayed in Paul's life. He was now all alone on his own, and he was still visiting Paul and really trying to manage his own way of life. Not to consider the fact that where Charles lived and where Doreen had now moved her two kids into his house, it was only 6 blocks away, about a 6-minute walk. Now, to consider that Mike was in love with her at one point, he had thought that he was going to spend the rest of his life with her, I can imagine this might have weighed on him pretty much a ton. It was probably a struggle for him to realize that not only had she left him, had another baby with another man, but she was not living even that far away. She was living walking distance away from this man, and this was going to weigh on Mike a whole lot throughout this entire case. Now, since Doreen's passing throughout the previous decades, Charles has actually come out to do some interviews, different interviews describing how she was as a person, his perception of her, their way of life together, and just how he saw her, saying things like, well, she was an angel, and when she smiled, when she laughed, you really couldn't help but just love her. She was always giving, always caring, and so in his own way, he probably wasn't the only one who had been in love or who had loved her just like Mike. Now, as far as Mike goes in their relationship that never worked out, maybe Mike thought that he was going to spend the rest of his life with her, but maybe she had figured out that there was something missing. Maybe she didn't have as much chemistry with him as he did with her. Maybe she had realized that she wasn't going to spend the rest of her life with him, and maybe Charles was actually the one for her in that fact.
I've heard that Paul loved my dad like he was his own, and my dad loved him like he was his own child too.
There could really be a million different reasons why she ended up choosing Charles over Mike in the end, but not nearly as many, if any at all, reasons why her life ended up in such a brutal, bloody disembodiment. And yes, that was still impending for just the darker twists, the more morbid reality of what this story was going to end up to be, and I just hate to bring it up. Although the Erbert family was in a new way of things, well, they still had a lot to learn. especially for Doreen and her new husband Charles. And yes, he did view her as an angel. She did bring brightness to the four of their lives, but maybe they had taken some things for granted. Some of those cherished moments that they had lived through for the first couple of years that they were at his house. Maybe some of that stuff was boiling up, and they were about to be revealed to what their choices would have as consequences for the entire family. It was around February of 1980, and the family was doing well. They had a nice house, they were establishing themselves, they had a nice backyard, the backyard even had a pool. And Paul was doing his own thing as a little boy toddler, playing by himself in the backyard, since of course his sister was far too young to know what was going on, to talk, walk, or really anything around Paul, since he might play a little rough or get messy around being a little boy. And Doreen was pretty much used to this. She was in the house, really not paying any mind to what Paul was doing, and she probably just innocently saw him as being a little boy doing his own thing as people do as a family. But as casual and innocent as their day-to-day might have been, as much as Doreen might have just been used to being around the house while Paul would be in the backyard playing on his own, just doing whatever, this might have ended up being a real bad thing that would happen to their family in terms of how it would end up, because there was one day where this all took a turn for the worst, where Doreen was in the house, Paul was playing outside the house, and he ended up getting some curiosity going.
Mom was attending to me, and Paul was out back playing with his ball. And there was a 6-foot fence around the pool, and Paul was playing back there, and she looked away for 1 second, and when she looked back there again, she didn't see him. And so she started walking around, calling his name, and she found him in the deepest end of the pool.
Time had passed, and the kid had drowned. He had suffocated, and Doreen hadn't known this at the time. And at this point, she would try and save him, try pulling him out of the water, try helping him, and there was nothing to be done at this point. He had to be called into an ambulance and rushed to the hospital, where he was then put on life support. And he was on life support for 3 days, or about a week. This time had gone by, and the doctors couldn't do anything about it. Too much damage had been done to this poor boy, and he actually ended up dying in the hospital after the few days had passed. He had died at the age of 4 years old. Now, since Doreen was the mother, she was the parental guardian, she was in the house, and while she could be seen as neglecting Paul, this could be seen as her fault for not being responsible and noticing that he was literally drowning to death. And this perception wouldn't be completely wrong. She was a responsible adult, or irresponsible in this case, and a perception of her grew, especially for Mike. The woman that he had once been in love with, the woman that he had once wanted to spend the rest of his life with, he grew a sort of hatred for her, and he grew pretty cold towards her over the next couple of years, trying to cope with the loss of his only son that had literally drowned to death at such a young age, and rightfully so. But he really wasn't able to handle all of this, and he wanted to take it a step further. He would want to eventually, in 1982, file a wrongful death lawsuit against the Erbert family in their entirety. He really wanted to bring justice to his one and only son that was no longer living. But to Mike's cold world, now that he no longer had Paul, his only son, and growing up with his hardships, things continued to be in the favor of others. And that lawsuit, he ended up losing, and it ended up being in the favor of the Erbert family. And after that, he continued to struggle in his life. As a lonely father that had lost his son, lost his marriage, he not only would lose those two things, but things got hard for him at work too with Lockheed. He'd end up having to take a major salary reduction, and so he was going broke in the process. And not only that, but the job continued to get worse for him over time, and he would eventually lose his job. He'd get fired. This was just not going well for him in life. And he was growing even worse. He was growing angry. He was just growing hatred toward everyone, especially with Doreen. More than anything, with the loss of his son Paul, he was just cold against her, and he started to blame her for most of his hardships in life, especially putting blame on her for the death of Paul. It just really took a toll on him and succumbed him in his entire way of life. He grew angry at everyone around him, and even some of his friends noticed just how it was changing him as a man. And Jim Perriott, one of his friends, even said in some statements that he blamed her for the death of Paul, that it was pretty much a murder scene. And his anger didn't stop there. He would continue to blame her, and saying that it was probably intentional, that she intentionally killed Paul by neglecting him in that way.
Destroyed his life. I mean, the hope of him ever having a family again of his own and another child. So yeah, it destroyed his life and those around him.
And Mike actually wouldn't be the only one to be facing a dark life and to be angry about everything around him. He wouldn't be the only one to be in his villain era of life to blame Doreen, and Doreen might end up blaming herself in that way because, well, as far as she was moving on and winning the lawsuit throughout the next couple of years with Charles, they would end up wanting to grow their family after she lost her only son as well, but they would end up wanting to have another baby. They would be trying and trying and trying for a couple of years, but they also had a couple of miscarriages, and this took a toll on Doreen. But things would actually end up once again taking a turnaround for the better for Doreen, as it kind of seems to be that way in this entire case. Although it might be its own pain and loss of its own respect, being that she was trying to become more of a mother and trying to get pregnant once again, and she'd have this baby, or actually two of them, that would die before even taking their first breaths. Well, that's its own morbidity and tragedy of its own. But eventually they would overcome this. They would keep trying, and they would be able to salvage this moment once again, and even Charles would come out in another statement saying, well, finally they have their moment, finally she got pregnant. And since Charles was now going to be that home stability that Doreen wanted, they wanted to grow a family, they wanted it to be sustainable, and they didn't want to have any problems amongst themselves. Well, this was now Charles' opportunity. He wanted to be there for the girls, and this time he definitely wouldn't need to do the weekly visits. It was unfortunate for Mike that became the matter, but now Charles was going to be able to have that at-home father life. So as the three of them were now expecting this newborn baby, and Deanna was now growing into her own toddler years, the family was excited. They were looking forward to this, and the baby was also due in November of 1984. And that is kind of the cute aspect of that I thought was about this story, because Deanna was born in November, now her baby brother will be born in November, and they're going to have the same birthday month, and that's just a sort of adorable sibling aspect since they're an intimate small family, and now they get to enjoy the holidays together in that way. And Doreen had just as much to look forward to about this. After those miscarriages, she was plenty excited about being a new baby boy mom, and her sister had a lot to say about this as well, making fun of her, that she had this bright personality, but it definitely outshined how short she was, under 5 feet tall, and she was just as far out as she was high, excited about looking forward to this new boy in the family. And while time was quickly passing by, well, the Erbert family was also doing other things together, like spending time during the holidays as they were now approaching. October was now in session, fall was now in season, and just like when this Crime Entries episode was uploaded, I love fall. This season is amazing, and for the family of three, well, it was now October 31st, the night of Halloween in 1984. And Deanna and Doreen were actually out trick-or-treating. They had gone walking out through the streets of their neighborhood. They had now really settled in as a family, and they were enjoying themselves like some Hallmark movie. Charles had actually stayed home to hand out candy, but they had now approached this sense of belonging, this comfortability, and they were doing things as families should. And, well, these girls were out trick-or-treating for a while, a few hours actually, and the night was passing by. They had probably grown tired of walking and knocking door to door to grab this candy, so it was about time for them to go home. They were now going to relax, watch some TV, Deanna was going to enjoy her candy, and they were just going to be a family together. But Charles had ran out of candy at this point. This shows like the entire neighborhood was comfortable in going to their house for candy especially, and well, he was now going to have to go to the store to buy more candy. And he was also going to stop for some liquor at the local store. And during this time, well, it was pretty much the family staying in the living room. Deanna and Doreen were just relaxing, waiting for Charles to get back home. But it was now late at night, and it was about 9 p.m., and they heard a knock at the front door. And while Charles wouldn't usually knock, he would just walk in. So who was there knocking at 9 o'clock at night? Maybe it was a trick-or-treater. Deanna had actually spoken in some interviews in 2018, just recounting her memories of this night and just how things felt a little bit off. As in, well, this could have been a trick-or-treater. That was the best case scenario that could have happened late at night while these two girls were alone. Charles, the only man in the house that could help them in the situation, was out. He was nowhere to be found, and he wouldn't be home for at least a few minutes. And so she said that this knock wasn't a usual knock. It wasn't an innocent kid knocking. It was a really loud, aggressive, hard banging against the door. This person was really certain to just get their attention and was knocking very aggressively. And this should have set off some alarms. But to their innocence, Doreen actually went to go answer the door. Maybe she thought it was a trick-or-treater, but things were about to get really messy. And as Doreen opened the door, to her surprise, it wouldn't just be an innocent little kid trick-or-treating. Instead, it was a tall man. And this tall man didn't have a bucket or a bag for some Halloween candy. Instead, he had a big, bad, spooky, disgusting wolf mask and Halloween costume. And instead of a bucket for candy, Deanna said that he was carrying an 18-inch big machete. And in that moment, he told Doreen, "I'm going to kill you," as if that isn't the most terrifying and morbid thing to hear when you're alone. And in that moment, Doreen also yelled at Deanna, saying, "Go hide, go be safe, find a hiding spot, and don't come out." And so that's what she did. And to her very eyes, some really dark, twisted, and gruesome moments were about to unfold before Deanna's and Doreen's eyes. Now, being a kid, 4 years old, 3 years old, no matter how old you were as a kid, this has to be the most terrifying moment of your so far short existence. But for Deanna, she was pretty brave about all of it. I mean, in this moment, she heard her mom fighting off this big bad wolf man in a costume with this giant machete. She heard her mom screaming, kicking, fighting with all of her might, all of her strength, just trying to get this guy out of the house, trying to fight him off so that she could keep Deanna safe. But to Deanna's knowledge, and from what she had remembered, even though she was hiding and trying to just not be seen by this guy that was trying to kill her mom, she ended up peeking out here and there. She ended up trying to see just what was happening, and any kid might have been too scared to do that. But for Deanna, she just wanted to make sure that her mom was okay, and she was trying to make sure of that in any way that she could, even though she was now hiding behind this couch in their living room, trying to stay as quiet as she could while this was all happening right beside her. And not only was she peeking out of her hiding spot, but she had actually grown some more bravery, and she actually left that spot not just once, but twice. Once to sort of look around the house to see what was happening, so yeah, she got a visual of all of this, and another time to go and get her blankie to help comfort her in this situation. And of course, after that, she luckily got back to her hiding spot. Luckily, this masked wolfman intruder didn't see her running around the house, and well, she was able to get back to her spot. And in that moment, she actually heard this masked intruder wolfman say, "If you say anything, if I see you, I'm going to come back and I'm going to kill you too." So of course, she didn't leave her spot again. She ended up staying in that spot for a few more minutes until she actually heard Charles getting back home after a few minutes. Only he had gotten back and a little bit too much time had passed. It was too late for him to do anything, he would come to find out. So Charles was getting back into the driveway, and he was getting off his car just casually about to get back into his home and see his two girls, so he thought. But instead, he saw that his door was wide open and unlocked. Of course, this wasn't normal. Deanna was a toddler, and so where was Doreen? Well, once he got back into the house, he saw a bloody murder scene. He saw Doreen there lying on the ground in a pool of her own blood. Not only did he find Doreen lying there dead, or at least dying in that moment, but he'd find his fetus, his baby boy, that was chopped up, lying there on the ground next to her. And this is just part of this crime story that I really dreaded talking about. This is just terrible, because it gets so much worse than this. And later on, once the police would be called, well, Charles had said that he had been gone for only about 15 minutes. Now, that 15 minutes was short, but it was also way too long. for these two girls to be alone by themselves and for all of this to happen right on his watch. I mean, to be the head of the household, to recognize that this was already Charles' own house and he had gotten back so innocently just shopping for candy and some liquor for himself and Doreen. Now he had gotten back to this giant murder scene, this pool of blood where his wife was laying in it, taking her last breaths. This had to have been the most traumatizing event of their entire existence, especially for Deanna, and it was so bad, there was so much blood, that Charles actually had slipped in it, and he was getting ready to call the police, but he luckily asked Deanna to go to the neighbor's house. Get out of here, go somewhere safe, go across the street to somebody that can take care of you, as he was probably freaking out, just trying to absorb what had happened. Just like Deanna had probably absorbed already so much trauma of seeing this morbid, gruesome, and gory thing unfolding right in their living room. Alright everyone, before we get into the rest of this Crime Entries episode, if you believe that Doreen Erbert or her fetus deserve any bit of justice, in the next 5 seconds, deep dive into that subscribe button to never miss a crime story. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Did you do it? Yes? Alright, let's move on with this case.
Fire department being there first, when he got there, what he said over the air lit us up and told us to kick it up because something was definitely wrong. It was the inflection in his voice that there was a problem. He was scared. There was something wrong. And all of us picked up on it, and we put the pedal to the metal to get over there.
Even as the police were being called, and once they had arrived to this scene, they were going to step into the most gruesome depiction of a horror crime they probably had ever seen. They had stated that it was just blood everywhere. Even as the police were being called, and once they had arrived to this scene, they were going to step into the most gruesome depiction of a horror crime they probably had ever seen. They had stated that it was just blood everywhere. They saw blood all over the ceiling, the floors, spilled everywhere, all over the walls. It was just an entire disgusting crime. And not only that, but Charles himself was pretty emotional. I mean, I think he would be, just screaming, yelling, and crying, becoming erratic and uncontrollable is how they described him. So much uncontrollable that an officer, Jamie Saldivar, had stated in this case that they placed him into the patrol car because he was so uncontrollable, and they just didn't want to deal with this as they were trying to uncover the events that had unfolded. And he was so erratic that he was punching and kicking the patrol car window trying to get out, saying, "My wife, my wife, my wife." He needed to get to her. He needed to make sure that she'd be okay, and they just weren't having it. They were trying to separate him from the entire situation. He was just innocently getting back from going for candy and some liquor to celebrate with Doreen on Halloween night. He had gotten back after the fact, and he was emotional. I don't blame him for that. Anybody might be emotional in that moment, especially kicking and screaming when the officers aren't listening to him.
Because we were in and out of the crime scene. That's when I looked and I noticed that the Halloween night, there was lit jack-o'-lanterns on the steps up to the front door. And inside the front door where the body had laid, apparently, where the paramedics had picked her up from, Doreen, the blood was probably, it was coagulating. It was probably a couple inches thick. It was pretty thick. And I remember my boots sticking to the blood. When I looked into the foyer, the blood was splattered all throughout. Quite a few of the paramedics quit.
And she had a severed hand in the process, which is just one of the things that they found about this situation. They also found the fetus lying there on the floor and gaping wounds that had taken the fetus out of the womb, and that fetus was lying next to her severed hand, and the fetus had a severed leg. This was just a gruesome uncovering of a situation that these officers were not prepared for, and it didn't stop there. These officers were about to see that she had been stabbed and cut almost everywhere around her body. She had multiple cuts to her head, both on the left and right side. Some of them penetrated her skull, and even more were penetrating around 2 inches into her brain. They also found some deep cuts on her left shoulder, around her back area, and 3 or 4 cuts to her breasts. They found cuts and lacerations everywhere, some even on her stomach, and these cuts were definitely from a large blade, just deep wounds that were pouring blood and leaving her almost decapitated. Whoever was that masked man intruder who knocked on the door aggressively and said, "I'm going to kill you," to Doreen, really cut her up terribly, leaving pretty much nothing left of her body or neither her fetus, cutting them both up, chopping up their bodies in multiple different places, especially the head, the stomach, her shoulders, her breasts, and even severing parts of the fetus. He made a mess out of 2 innocent lives, and to come to find out that she was pregnant, I mean, how could this person not tell that she was pregnant, and especially targeting someone like that? This person showed no remorse, soullessness, just coldness all over, and it radiated through this house as these detectives and officers were just uncovering the spillage of blood from these 2 innocent people that were just trying to have a good Halloween night. Now, as far as the initial investigations had gone, as far as people arriving on scene and paramedics trying to help in any way that they could, they had actually seen that Doreen was actually still breathing. As if the traumatic experience wasn't enough for her, she had to also endure the pain of still being somewhat alive. Now, they tried to perform life-saving measures for her, at least. As far as her fetus goes, though, they did determine that he was unable to be resuscitated, and this family was going through a loss all over again. They had been broken yet again. Now, they did take Doreen, and through the ambulance with the paramedics, they tried to get her to the hospital. Now, as they were trying to bring her back to life, trying to do any life-saving precautions and measures in the ambulance itself, even before they got to the hospital, well, once they got there, the emergency physicians had determined that she was too far gone. She was even dead on the scene, and dead before they even got to the hospital. So through the following investigations of that night and into the next morning, the investigators had brought on an expert on blood splatter into the whole crime scene, which would go on to say that everything about this event, from the jack-o'-lantern to the stool, to the walls and on the floor, all of these blood patterns that they had seen were velocity stains, they called them, which would mean eventually that while these blood splatter stains were going all over the house, that it was because of just how aggressive this machete-wielding assailant was flinging that thing back and forth. With so much aggression, it wasn't just a simple chop here and there. It was really, really harsh on the body. So harsh, in fact, that it was sending giant splatters all over the place. Once they had actually examined this entire room with these velocity stains on it, they had actually seen that there was also a trail of blood leading outside and onto the nearby sidewalk in front of the front door entrance. Now, this person took it upon themselves to just walk away from the crime scene after they had committed this tragedy. They didn't take any second to clean anything. They didn't take a second to hide the weapon that they'd used. No, they just walked off casually off into the streets, into the distance, with their machete still bloody and dripping, which is how these detectives and the blood expert found this trail to begin with. No mercy, no remorse, no second thought. And at that point, once they'd noticed that this blood trail was pretty much leading off the property and into another direction of the distance in the street, they had realized, well, where is everything else of evidence here? Where are the pieces of the puzzle that this person was wearing? And they had actually found that wolf mask. This disgusting, bulging eyes, tongue sticking out, making an entire face, all the works of just a really creepy mask that I wouldn't want to be seen anywhere with, even if it was Halloween. Just something disgusting. Well, they had determined that since Charles had been in the police car this entire time, he wouldn't have been able to walk back and forth with this exact pattern of these bloodstains on the street, so they eventually determined that he was no longer the main person of interest at this point finally, and they had maybe thought, well, this mask doesn't belong to the Erbert's residence whatsoever. We needed to be looking for something else, someone else. Once these detectives and the blood splatter expert had seen how this trail just kind of abruptly ends out on the sidewalk, now they'd found the mask, and Charles was in the police car this entire time, well, they had maybe thought, where does this blood trail end? Because it didn't necessarily stop just there. It actually kept going once they had further investigated the streets, and it actually had led to a catwalk in the nearby area, which would go onto a highway. Now, at this point, they had recognized that this person was still out there. This person was walking the neighborhood where other kids, other families were all out on the street. Is there any other victims? Who was this? Where could they have gone? And how far was this trail going to lead? Because it was now going across the neighborhood. So they had maybe thought, we should think about who the other suspects might be. And they had remembered and recognized that, well, there was someone else that had past troubles with this family. Past court troubles, maybe specifically, who is Mike Dennis. They had took into consideration how he had lost Paul. And well, being that Doreen wasn't directly involved with this, they now thought maybe this could be the exact motive that they were looking for. So they made their way to Mike's house, who was again, as we cannot forget, lived only 6 blocks away, less than a mile away. So they got there, and this detective, Bert Caro, actually took it upon himself to bring his flashlight, and as they got into Mike's driveway, he took a peek into Mike's driveway and saw some really morbid, creepy stuff. He looked at his steering wheel, his gear shift knob, the front seat of the truck or the car that he was driving, and what was all over it? Blood. Blood all over everything, even the keys where the ignition was. Leading up to Mike's driveway, these detectives were going in cautiously after they had just seen some blood all over his car, wondering what could have happened here, what a coincidence. So they knocked on Mike's door. And they'd actually tried knocking a few different times, and he wasn't answering. But at the same time, they had heard some running water inside of his house, and the lights were on. So obviously, he was home, and he just was taking forever to answer. Finally, he did answer, and he was casually wearing a bathrobe and said, well, come on inside. So the detectives took it upon themselves to cautiously go on ahead and interview him. And while they were interviewing him, they noticed some things were a little bit strange. Not only was he a little bit hesitant to speak, but once they had told him, hey man, your ex-wife was just murdered. Might you know anything about this? He just was very casual about it, saying, no, I don't know anything. I have nothing to do with that. And, well, I'm not even distraught. He was not stressed. He was not anxious. None of that. And you might be if one of your family members had been murdered, especially by a guy with a machete, which is what they had figured was the weapon used as far as a blade goes. And he wasn't at all. But what they did notice was that he had a bandage on one of his hands. And that bandage was getting full of blood, as if it was a fresh wound. They questioned him about this bandage, though, and he said, it was an accident. I was carving a pumpkin. It's Halloween, you know? I'm just over here carving a pumpkin, and I had an accident, the knife slipped, and I cut my hand. Now, this pretty much was the beginning of what was not going to help Mike in the situation whatsoever. After these detectives had noticed his blood on the bandage, well, he said, I have nothing to hide. You can go ahead and search my house for all I care. He was really just calm. His whole demeanor was just off about this entire situation. So these detectives made their way through his house. And what they would find is a bunch of different articles of clothing, a bunch of different areas, and what did all these things have on them? They found his jeans on his bed. Those had bloodstains on them. They found his keys. That had bloodstains on it. They found some other shirts of clothing inside of his washer and dryer. They had clothing out in the bathroom in the garage where he had bandages that were already used, had blood on it. Throughout his driveway, there was another trail of blood. It just was not going good for Mike at any point throughout any of this. And the detectives had thought, well, we gotta get this guy. So this Detective Caro was actually the one to go ahead and say, you know what, I see all of this blood on himself, blood on his clothes, around his house. I gotta handcuff this guy and take him in. So that's just what they did. They went ahead and booked him and drove him to the police station, but they didn't really have enough to really connect him to the exact murder scene just yet. Just a bunch of blood from his apparent pumpkin cutting accident. And after a couple of days, they actually had to release him for lack of evidence. But these detectives weren't done just yet. They had some more things up their sleeves, especially for what the nearby neighbors and people that saw all of this happening would have to eventually say. especially someone that actually knew Mike and might have actually recognized this wolf mask from a similar thing to a thing he wore at a party about a year prior to that. And so while these detectives were gathering more evidence, maybe even some eyewitness accounts and even a person that knew him in the past, they were also planning to do a second, more thorough interview of his home and property. And what they would find was just completely terrifying. They didn't find the blade, but they did find a label for an 18-inch machete blade, which sounds pretty familiar, right? Not only that, but in his garage, they ended up finding a couple of body bags. They also found 2 handmade coffins. Handmade. One bigger, one smaller, for like maybe the size of a kid, like Deanna. Maybe one for Charles. But he wasn't home at the time, so obviously this plan didn't work out. They also found a map of the San Francisco Bay Area, and the investigators determined that he was probably planning to dump the bodies in the San Mateo Bridge. Now, ultimately, even though they didn't just find the exact machete that was used in the crime scene just yet, they did find the label and a receipt to a local hardware store called Milipitas Builders Emporium. There they went themselves to buy one of those machetes, and they found out that the label that they found in Mike's closet, which was the label to a blade, also exactly matched the same 18-inch machete blade that these detectives bought themselves. They were exact and matched up, and so obviously he had a blade somewhere, and later on it was eventually introduced into the evidence that they found. But they also had interviewed a local neighbor named Don Isbell, who was, of course, out trick-or-treating with his kids at the time of this all happening. Actually, a little bit earlier, they had gone to the Erbert home and seen Doreen, noticed that she was obviously pregnant, and that's what they had said in the interview. Now, while they were out trick-or-treating, they not only had seen Doreen herself, but they'd also noticed around 7 p.m. a man standing outside of the Erbert's home, just there, with a wolf mask. Sort of like the mask that was resemblant to the one that they found at the crime scene. Now, after they had left, he took his kids to a Halloween party at the local school, what a parent might do on a Halloween night, and, well, the kid actually saw this man too. So there was about to be a whole lot of witness accounts that were coming forth throughout this investigation that were just further against Mike. Not only that, but they'd seen him around 8:55 p.m. walking along the streets of where Mike lived. And he was walking from the direction of where Mike lived around to where a pedestrian overpass was. This overpass that pretty much connected his neighborhood where Mike lived to Doreen's neighborhood. This might even sound familiar from the local blood patterns that they found in the neighborhoods. Well, luckily, at this point, the detectives and the blood expert had actually taken some samples from the blood trail that they'd found, and they'd matched it up to the exact match of blood that was around Mike's home. And so on November 5th, pretty much not even a week after this event had occurred, they arrested him, and they had continued to do further interviews of people that knew him, that might have seen him, especially with someone that was with him at a Halloween party a year prior, who had stated that they'd seen him wearing a goofy-looking Halloween wolf mask at this party. Now, this detective was questioning the individual who was with him at the party, crossing his fingers, just hoping that the questions he'd ask were the right ones that would indefinitely match him up to how this Halloween costume looked. And so he was saying, well, does this look familiar? Was this wolf mask familiar to you at this party? Were there any pictures taken that you can recount? And this person said, oh yeah, this man took a lot of pictures with that wolf mask. And, well, they brought up the exact photo from that party. And it was the same wolf mask from the year prior that he wore to the party that was used in this crime scene. And Mike was indefinitely arrested and placed into jail, and he would go on to trial a few years later in July of 1988. He would then ultimately plead guilty to the first-degree murder of Doreen and the second-degree murder of the unborn fetus. But throughout the trial, it was kind of a rocky situation. As far as his defense counsel goes, they were really trying to claim his innocence throughout all of this, and even pleaded that he was not premeditated, that in committing these murders, he was actually kind of psychotic. And throughout the previous years, When Paul drowned and he had gotten angry, this had pretty much made him crazy. And it had damaged his brain and his mentality so much so that he had just felt the need to kill Doreen. And this was their claim, that he didn't really mean to do it. He was just so angry having to deal with this for the few years that it finally just overcame his mentality. This is really what they had to say in terms of claiming his innocence.
I would love for him to be a free man, because I know that he would never, this man is no serial killer, this man is no psychopath. This man went totally and completely insane, in my belief, for a short, horrible, terrible period of time. I struggle with this, but I do feel that Mike's character was strong, and he was pushed over the edge. Had the drowning not occurred, this would never have happened.
The psychiatrist on Mike's defense counsel actually tried to argue and pin it all on Doreen, saying that Mike believed that Doreen wanted Paul to die. And so now they were just trying to make it seem like she was the bad person in all of this that really made Mike crazy enough to perform these acts, and that Mike needed help. And so under these special circumstances that his psychiatrist was trying to argue with the jury, they had now tried to decide whether he needed the gas chamber or life in prison without parole.
Kill him. No, completely useless to society. And I'll take one step further. This garbage about the death penalty, if anybody got to see those crime scene photos, I don't see how one person with common sense would say, execute that guy, execute him now. He shouldn't even be breathing the air that we're breathing right now. He has no value to society whatsoever. Life in prison without parole, that's crap.
Their entire thing was that Mike had gone so crazy and fixating and fantasizing about killing Doreen because of the death of Paul that he had gone so crazy, and they wanted him to instead be charged with voluntary manslaughter instead of murder, and because of his mental state that he was dealing with problems and needed a lighter sentencing than to be put to death, which I think is just insensitive on the entire defense counsel, knowing that they had acknowledged that a fetus had been killed in all of this, and that Mike had, regardless of him dressing up, taking a machete, dressing up as a trick-or-treater, and having, Deanna witness all of it, that it was still okay, and Mike needed help more than his consequences. This didn't make any sense to me. And Mike, in his apparent psychosis during court from all of this due to his psychiatrist trying to defend him, he wasn't done just yet, and he had a little bit more to say. And so once they had reached their verdict that they were going to put him away, he was being passed through the court from the officers, being taken into prison, and along passing the people that were related to Doreen and Charles, he said quietly, just to them, "Good night." As if this wasn't enough of a provocative and enticing thing for him to say, knowing that he had done this tragedy, and now he was just kind of throwing it back into their families' faces. So ultimately, in the court's closing arguments, they pretty much weren't having it for the defense counsel and how they were describing how Mike had gone mad as far as it being Doreen's fault for letting Paul die. They were just not claiming that he actually was innocent in all of this and needed help. So the district attorney, Paul Cuddy, eventually was just describing this guy knew that he was going to wear this mask, he knew that he was going to dress up posing as a trick-or-treater, and he knew that he was going to butcher her along with her fetus. So they really didn't buy any of the defense counsel's arguments, and they would eventually submit him to the gas chambers, and he was sentenced to death in 1999. But it kind of didn't really hold up. They ended up switching his sentencing, and it was ultimately life in prison.
In terms of being on condemned row, he has the best situation that you could hope for. He's out of his cell 6 hours a day. He's with 12 other inmates. They can go up and play basketball. He runs. But they can interact. They can go in each other's cells. They can watch TV. If there's a sporting event on, they can watch that together. I mean, if you're going to be on death row, that's where you would want to be. But it takes 10 years of perfect behavior to get on the list to get into that situation. So it's not something that's easily acquired. It sounds hard, but I've never heard him say he was sorry for what happened to Doreen.
Lots of time had passed as the decades went on, and Charles Erbert and Deanna were now together. They were doing an interview. He was now 65, she was 43. They had a lot of time to think over this and to really grow as people, and so in their interviews, they pretty much explained that they were still in favor of the death penalty against Mike, that they thought that he definitely deserved this. And, well, Charles was actually going through his Bible and stating that, well, the Bible tells us that a man shouldn't kill, but if he does, he should surely be put to death. And they were both in support of the death penalty and hope that he would still indefinitely receive it, because they didn't see any other way about this. But they definitely wanted Mike to know that they're okay. They've really grown as people. They love each other. They still have each other. He's in prison, and they haven't conquered it just yet. He hasn't conquered them, and they haven't been conquered. And they were going to continue trying to survive with these wretched, horrifying memories, especially Deanna. I really feel sorry for her as an adult at this point. She had to go through a whole lot, and she probably still is. If I were her, I'd have continuous PTSD nightmares, for Christ's sake. So as far as how they're doing throughout the past few years, well, Charles and Deanna are a bit older now. They want to find peace and resolution out of all of this, and they want to kind of move on with their lives. So they've said that they've forgiven Mike, and they just want to move on and find love in life again. I don't blame them. They really deserve some peace after all of this, especially Deanna. She probably has some major PTSD and night terrors from all of this. No kid should have to watch that event take place. It's unspeakable, really. And as far as Mike goes, he's still on death row throughout the past few years in San Quentin State Prison. That's where he deserves to be. If it's not death row, then it's definitely not on the streets where he can hurt someone again. And, well, if you guys have found any insight or entertainment throughout this Crime Entries episode, I have more that I'm covering on the channel. You can go ahead and find one of those, and I will see you all in the next one.